In 2012, the Philippines faced humiliation. A shoal was lost, rich with fish, pride, and control. No war was declared, but the wound cut deep. By 2016, the battlefield shifted to a courtroom. In The Hague, judges stripped China's sweeping claims as baseless. The ruling flipped maps into weapons sharper than missiles. And now in 2025, the story has turned again. Allied patrols sail daily in Philippine waters. A coalition stands where once the nation stood alone. This small archipelago has no nuclear weapons. It has no carrier fleets, yet it has flipped the balance against a superpower. Every blockade, every water cannon strike now weakens Beijing's hand, not Manila's. For a nation once bullied at Scarborough, this transformation is deeply personal. The bullied has become the rule maker. But the urgent question remains, can the Philippines keep its edge? Or will one miscalculation spark the war Asia fears most? This is not history. It is unfolding now, with every patrol, every collision, every risk. This is the untold story of how the Philippines defeated China without firing a bullet, and why the next move could decide Asia's future. In 2009, the Philippines made a move that seemed small. It passed Republic Act 9522. On paper, it simply defined the country's baselines, but this paper act carried a blade sharper than steel. By law, Manila drew lines around the West Philippine Sea. It named the waters. It marked the zones. It stamped sovereignty into official maps. What looked like a legal technicality became a fortress on paper. China's sweeping 9-dash line claimed nearly the entire South China Sea. But the Philippines had quietly placed its own boundaries. It locked them with signatures, seals, and the force of law. For a small archipelago, this was the first true sword. It was not fired from a gun. It was not launched from a ship. It was carried in documents, in maps, in international law. Beijing responded with its gray zone tactics, surveys, encroaching ships, the slow tightening of presence without open war. Manila's shield was legal. China's push was practical. And the tension climbed step by step. For every patrol Manila sent, Beijing sent more. For every protest Manila filed, Beijing dug deeper. The world barely noticed. But in Manila, leaders knew. This paper shield would be tested. And that test came at a tiny reef, rich in fish, poor in defense. By 2012, the storm broke at Scarborough Shoal. The Philippines stood face to face with China on the water. No more maps. No more lines, only ships locked in a standoff. And when the shoal was lost, Manila entered its darkest hour. But from that humiliation, a new path was forced, the path that would carry them to the court in The Hague. By 2013, the humiliation of Scarborough was raw. Ships were gone, waters lost, trust shattered. The Philippines had no nuclear weapons, no carrier fleets, no chance to fight China ship for ship. But it had one weapon left. Law. On January 22, 2013, Manila filed a case under UNCLOS arbitration. It was not Philippines versus China at sea. It was Philippines versus China in a courtroom. No allies stood beside them. No great powers offered guarantees. It was David, filing against Goliath, alone. Beijing raged. It warned of consequences. It declared the tribunal illegitimate. It threatened that Manila would pay for its defiance. But Manila did not back down. For a small nation, it was the boldest gamble in its history. The risk was enormous. If the case failed, the Philippines would not just lose territory, it would lose face. It would lose the trust of its own people. It would stand humiliated twice. But if it won, the world itself would have to listen. Every map, every baseline, every claim would be judged not by China's power, but by the rules of the sea. For years, the tribunal reviewed evidence, Chinese maps, Filipino arguments, the meaning of reefs, rocks, and shoals under UNCLOS. Manila stood firm. It endured Beijing's fury. It endured threats of economic and political punishment. Because the alternative, silence, meant surrender without a fight. And so the Philippines chose to fight not with ships, but with lawfare. It was a lonely battle, but it was also history in the making. And then, in 2016, the ruling came, a judgment that would stun the globe. On July 12, 2016, history was written in The Hague. The Permanent Court of Arbitration delivered its long-awaited ruling. The verdict was clear. China's sweeping 9-dash line had no basis in international law. For the first time, the map Beijing waved across Asia was stripped of its legitimacy. The tribunal went further. It declared that Mischief Reef, long occupied by China, lay inside the Philippine Exclusive Economic Zone. It ruled that several other features claimed by Beijing were mere rocks, not islands, and carried no claim to vast waters. In one stroke, the smallest voice had silenced the loudest claim. A tiny archipelago had won against a global giant. The world reacted fast. The G7 nations endorsed the ruling. The United States declared it binding. Other allies echoed support. But Beijing's response was fury. It rejected the judgment outright. It vowed never to accept it. Its ships remained in the sea as if the ruling did not exist. This was the paradox. The Philippines had won on paper, but China still held the waters with power. Maps and law carried weight, but only if nations backed them. And so Manila faced its next challenge. The award was historic, but without enforcement, it risked becoming just words on a page. Would allies stand firm? Would coalitions rise? Would the legal victory be turned into a strategic one? The ruling had shaken the world, but it left Manila with a sharper question. Law had given the Philippines a sword, but without power, who would wield it? After the ruling in 2016, Manila faced a brutal truth. Paper alone could not guard the seas, but paper could summon allies. The Mutual Defense Treaty with the United States was reaffirmed. The Enhanced Defense Cooperation Agreement, EDCA, was upheld. And the Philippines opened its doors to expanded American access. By 2023, the number of strategic U.S. sites grew to 9. Some faced Taiwan. Others looked toward the contested Spratlys. Each one was more than a base. Each one was a silent promise of protection. Concrete runways became deterrents. Storage depots became tripwires. Every site told Beijing that an attack on Manila could pull in Washington. For a small archipelago, this alliance was a shield too large to break easily. But shields always invite tests. China pushed harder, sending Coast Guard cutters, maritime militia, and gray hulls to harass fishermen and block supply boats. Every act was meant to bully. Every clash was meant to remind the Philippines of its weakness. But behind those outposts, behind those agreements, stood a shadow of American power. Missiles, carriers, and jets were not always visible, but the knowledge of them lingered in the background, enough to make Beijing think twice. Still, Manila's sharpest weapon was not fired from a silo. It was not launched from a warship. It was not dropped from the sky. The most lethal tool was far quieter and far more public. It was a camera, watching every clash, recording every strike of a water cannon, turning every act of bullying into global outrage. After years of silence on the sea, Manila tried something new. It turned transparency into a weapon. Beginning in 2019, the Philippine Coast Guard carried cameras on every patrol, every clash, every ramming, every blast of a water cannon, all captured, all released. No longer could China hide behind denials. What happened on the waves was streamed in real time. The world could see, and the world could judge. The gamble reached its peak on March 5th, 2024. That day, Chinese ships unleashed high-powered water cannons. Several Filipino sailors were injured, but their pain did not stay in the dark. Images of bleeding faces and shattered decks went viral within hours. What was once just another clash at sea became a global headline. Foreign capitals condemned the attack. Allies voiced outrage. Even neutral nations took notice. For the first time, Filipino pain had become international pressure. China's secrecy clashed with Manila's sunlight, and sunlight was winning. The world had proof that the smallest navy was standing against the largest bully, and proof carried power. But transparency alone was not enough. A camera could win sympathy, but Manila needed muscle on the water, and soon it found it. The Philippines was no longer sailing alone. Allied patrols began to appear on the horizon. What started as live streams was about to become coalitions at sea. By 2023, the Philippines was no longer standing alone. Joint patrols with the United States began to crisscross the West Philippine Sea. What started as small maneuvers grew larger, stronger, louder. By 2024, more nations joined. Australia, Japan, even the idea of a new quadrilateral patrol was born. For the first time, China's bullying faced not one opponent, but many. And the turning point came in April 2024. 4 nations sailed together inside Philippine waters. The flags of Manila, Washington, Tokyo, and Canberra flew side by side. What had once been an archipelago isolated and humiliated had now become an anchor for coalitions. Every sail was a shield. Every patrol was a promise. From isolation to an international shield, the transformation was complete. But the symbolism ran deeper. In May 2024, President Marcos, President Biden, and Prime Minister Kishida held a historic summit. The message was unmistakable. An attack on the Philippines would no longer be a local matter. It would be a regional crisis, perhaps even a global one. For Beijing, the old playbook was broken. Its strategy of bilateral bullying was now met by multilateral defense. Every act of intimidation risked uniting its rivals further. But the coalition did not just sail. It drilled, it practiced, it prepared. And these drills carried the loudest message yet, that Manila was no longer defending its waters alone. The sea itself had become a stage where alliances showed their strength, and China was forced to watch. For years, Balikatan was seen as routine, a yearly drill, a photo opportunity, nothing more. But by 2023, that perception shattered. That year, 17,600 troops from the Philippines and the United States gathered. The biggest joint exercise in history. The message was clear. This was no longer symbolic. It was preparation. In 2024, Balikatan went further. Drills shifted from disaster response to island retaking scenarios. War games imagined hostile forces seizing reefs and shoals, and Filipino and American troops fighting to reclaim them. On Philippine soil, on Philippine waters, the exercises grew sharper, harder, more urgent. Then came 2025. The exercise was no longer just a drill. It was called a battle test. Live-fire missile launches, amphibious assaults, joint command structures practiced as if the war could start tomorrow. For the armed forces of the Philippines, once mocked as weak, this was a transformation. They were no longer observers in allied wars. They were now training for their own survival. Each drill carried a silent defiance. While the PLA Navy circled, while Chinese Coast Guard ships blasted water cannons, Manila and Washington rehearsed the very wars Beijing threatened. Conflict played out not on the front lines, but in simulations, in rehearsals, in unity. And the signal to Beijing was unmistakable. The Philippines was no longer alone and no longer unprepared, but America was not the only partner stepping in. From Europe to Asia, new allies were ready to link arms with Manila. The coalition was about to grow wider. By 2024, Manila's diplomacy had woven a new web. No strand stood alone. Each thread tied the Philippines closer to its neighbors. One link was with Vietnam. The two nations signed a hotline pact, a direct line for crises in the South China Sea. What once would have been silence was now instant coordination. Another strand came with Japan. Through the Reciprocal Access Agreement, Japanese troops could train and operate on Philippine soil. For the first time since World War II, Japan was binding its security to Manila's defense. Then came new patrol vessels and aid. Partners from Tokyo to Washington began funding Manila's Coast Guard fleet, ensuring that Philippine sailors no longer faced Beijing's ships empty-handed. Every clash at sea now triggered not bilateral anger, but regional pushback. When water cannons struck, condemnations rose not from Manila alone, but from capitals across Asia, Europe, and America. The transformation was profound. A nation once lonely in the shoals now stood inside a network of safety nets. Each ally, each agreement, each pact made Beijing's old divide and rule tactics harder to play. This is the moral of the story. In modern geopolitics, the weakest side can still win if it controls the rules of the game. From the humiliation of Scarborough in 2012 to the coalition patrols of 2025, the Philippines rose from isolation to influence. It became the rule maker, not the victim. It truly won without fighting. So the question now echoes far beyond these islands. If one small archipelago can turn maps and laws into sharper weapons than missiles, what excuse do larger nations have for surrendering to power without a fight? The story of the Philippines is proof that courage does not always need cannons. A nation once humiliated at a shoal has shown that power can be rewritten without firing a shot. It proved that wars today can be won in courts, in coalitions, and in cameras. The world saw it, the region felt it, and history will remember it, but this is not the end. The seas are still contested, the patrols still face collisions, the risks still climb with every passing week. If you want more hidden victories and the stories reshaping Asia's future, make sure to subscribe and share. Because these battles are not just Manila's, they belong to all who defend the rules. Now the question is yours. Has the Philippines already won the South China Sea without war? Or is the hardest test still to come?